Hitchhiking often promises exciting adventures, but sometimes it becomes the beginning of a horror you cannot foresee. My name is Jacob. I'm a truck driver, and my job involves delivering cargo from one end of the country to the other. On this particular day, I was driving through Oklahoma when I noticed a figure standing on the roadside. The man looked strange, tall, skinny, with a large round head that seemed disproportionate to his body. He raised his hand, asking for help. My reasoning was simple. Nothing could go wrong if I gave someone a ride for a few miles. I stopped and opened the door. "Hi, where are you heading?" I asked. "To the nearest town, please," he replied in a hollow, almost mechanical voice. His voice gave me a sense of unease, but I attributed it to fatigue. The man climbed into the cab and sat next to me. His gaze was fixed on the road ahead, and his large round head turned slowly like a doll's. "What's your name?" I asked. "Danny," he answered briefly. The ride continued in silence that felt almost oppressive. I tried to make conversation, but Danny responded monosyllabically. My attempts to find a common topic failed. Suddenly, his hand reached for the radio, and it abruptly turned off, even though I didn't remember turning it on. And then I heard it. A quiet, raspy laugh. Turning around, I saw Danny smiling, his eyes gleaming with dark malice. "What's happening?" I asked, trying not to show my fear. "Nothing," he replied, smiling even wider. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. His presence became unbearable. I decided to find the nearest stop and drop him off there. But every time I looked in the rearview mirror, I saw his face, which seemed to deform, turning into something completely inhuman. Eventually, I stopped at a gas station in a small town called Norman. Danny got out of the cab without saying a word. I sighed in relief, but the feeling of anxiety didn't leave me. I decided to have a coffee and gather my thoughts. I was sitting in the cafe when I heard about the disappearances of people in this region. The description matched Danny. I felt uneasy, but I tried to convince myself it was just a coincidence. Returning to my truck, I saw a piece of paper left on the seat where Danny had been sitting. It read, "Thanks for the ride. This isn't the last time we'll meet." I felt a cold dread, but the worst happened that night when I hit the road again. Darkness enveloped the highway, and my truck's headlights illuminated only a few meters ahead. Suddenly, the radio turned on again, and I heard that same raspy laugh. I slammed on the brakes and, looking back, saw him. Danny stood in the light of the headlights, his face no longer human. The large round head had distorted into a grotesque mask of malevolence. "What do you want?" I shouted. The answer was short and terrifying. "You." He moved towards me with incredible speed. I felt something grab my throat, squeezing tighter every second. I tried to fight, but my strength quickly left me. His eyes glowed with hatred and fury. I realized this was the end. In the morning, the police found my truck on the roadside, but I was found alive nearby. I was severely injured, with multiple fractures and injuries. When asked what happened, I could barely speak. The doctor said I would have to undergo many surgeries and rehabilitation, but I was left disabled. Now I live in constant fear and pain. I know that this creature with the large round head will not stop until it finds me again. And every night I wake up to that same raspy laugh echoing in the darkness. My name is Jackson Miller. I was the kind of guy who loved to travel without a clear plan, relying only on random encounters and the kindness of strangers. My route through the southern states was chaotic, from New Orleans to small towns you wouldn't even find on a map. One day, while hitchhiking from the small town of Bakersfield to Atlanta, I stopped for the night at a motel called Sunshine, on the outskirts of an even smaller town called Prescott. The motel was old but clean, and that was all I needed. I threw my backpack on the bed and decided to take a walk to the nearest bar. The bar was typical for such places, small, cozy, filled with locals who loved to share stories about their adventures. I ordered a beer and sat at the bar, listening to the conversations around me. Soon, a man in his 40s with a thick beard and a friendly smile approached me. "Hi, my name is Tom," he introduced himself. "You're not from around here, are you?" "Hi, I'm Jackson." "No, I'm hitchhiking," I replied. Tom looked at me with interest. "Hitchhiking? That's always exciting. But be careful, we have our own stories around here," he said, squinting his eyes. "What kind of stories?" I asked, intrigued. "Well, there's a legend about a guy named Billy. He was a hitchhiker like you. One day he went missing while traveling this route," Tom began. "They say he wanders the roads still looking for the person who gave him his last ride." I smiled, but felt a slight chill down my spine. Stories about ghosts always scared me a bit, even if I didn't believe in them. That evening, I returned to the motel, pondering Tom's story. In the morning, I was back on the road, hoping to find a new ride to take me further. After a few hours of unsuccessful attempts to catch a ride, an old pickup truck finally stopped. The driver, a young man named Mike, offered to take me to the nearest town. We talked about everything: music, travel, adventures. Mike turned out to be a pleasant conversationalist. "You know, have you heard anything about this guy Billy?" I asked, trying to break the boredom of the road. Mike laughed. "Oh, that's an old tale. All the locals know it. Most think it's just a made-up story," he said, but his eyes darkened. "But," I prompted him to continue, "but there are those who believe it's true. Some even say they've seen him on the road. A ghost in an old hitchhiker's jacket," Mike added, glancing at me with a slight smile. We continued our journey when suddenly the pickup truck stalled on a remote stretch of road. Mike tried to start the engine, but nothing happened. He apologized and got out to check the engine. "Jackson, can you help me?" he called after a while. I got out of the truck and walked over to the hood. At that moment, I felt an unusual cold. Turning around, I saw the figure of a guy in a hitchhiker's jacket standing on the side of the road. His eyes were empty, like a doll's. "Mike, do you see that?" I asked, but when I turned back to the truck, Mike was gone. I stood on the road alone, looking around. The figure was approaching me, and I felt my heart beat faster. He raised his hand as if asking for help. "Billy?" I whispered. The figure stopped, then suddenly disappeared, leaving me alone in the middle of the road. I didn't understand what had happened, but I knew one thing. I needed to find help as quickly as possible. I started walking along the road, hoping to find the nearest town or at least some sign of life. Finally, after several hours of walking, I reached a small town called Florence. There I told my story to the locals, but they just smiled and nodded, as if they had heard it before. A few days passed, and I continued my journey. However, I could never forget that moment on the road. I found out that Mike never returned, and the pickup truck was found empty in the same place. Now, every time I travel by hitchhiking, I always think about Billy and those empty eyes on the side of the road. Maybe it was just a legend, or maybe he is really still looking for the person who gave him his last ride. But one thing I know for sure, there's more on the roads than just asphalt and cars. I have always been a seeker of adventure. Hitchhiking was the best way for me to feel the taste of freedom. One day, when I decided to travel from San Francisco to Los Angeles, I had no idea that this trip would change my life forever. It was a warm July night, and the road ahead of me seemed like an endless ribbon of black asphalt, illuminated only by the headlights of passing cars. I stood on the roadside, thumb raised, hoping someone would stop and give me a ride. After a while, an old pickup truck moving at a slow pace braked next to me. Behind the wheel sat a middle-aged man with deep wrinkles on his face. "Where are you headed?" he asked, rolling down the window. "Los Angeles, if possible," I replied hopefully. "Well, get in. I'm headed that way." I climbed into the truck, and we set off. His name was John, and he turned out to be quite a pleasant conversationalist. We discussed everything, from politics to music, and I felt comfortable. But after a while, I noticed that he often glanced at me in the rearview mirror as if trying to check something. This made me a bit uneasy, but I chalked it up to paranoia. After a few hours on the road, John suggested we stop at a small gas station. He said he needed to refuel and rest. We pulled over, and I decided to get myself a coffee. When I returned to the truck, John was nowhere to be seen. I looked around, but couldn't find him. After a few minutes, he reappeared with a strange expression on his face. "Sorry, I have some business to take care of here. You'll have to find another ride from the gas station." His voice sounded unusual, and it worried me, but I decided not to argue. I got out of the truck, said goodbye, and went in search of another ride. Soon, I found another driver, a young guy named Michael, who was headed to Los Angeles. He was cheerful and friendly. We drove, discussing future plans, when a strange figure appeared on the road in front of us. It was John. He stood in the middle of the road, staring straight at us. Michael braked sharply, and we nearly collided with him. I got out of the car to understand what was happening. "John, what are you doing here?" I shouted, but he stood silently, staring at me. His eyes glowed with a strange red light. Suddenly, he rushed at me with unusual speed. Michael tried to intervene, but John pushed him away with a single blow. Cold sweat broke out on my forehead, and I began to back away. "You can't run," John said with a wicked smile. "You're mine now." I tried to run, but strong hands grabbed me. I was dragged back to John's pickup. Everything went dark, and I lost consciousness. When I woke up, I was tied to a chair in a dark basement. John sat in front of me with that same wicked smile. "You must be wondering why I'm doing this," he said. "I've been looking for someone like you for a long time. You're special. You can open the gates." "What gates?" I asked, trying to free myself from the ropes. "The gates to another world," he replied. "A world where we will rule together." I didn't understand what he was talking about, but it didn't stop me. I gathered all my strength and broke free from the bonds. John tried to stop me, but I grabbed a heavy object from the floor and hit him on the head. He fell, and I ran to the door. Fortunately, the door was not locked, and I burst outside. I ran through the forest, not looking back, until I reached the road. There, I stopped a passing car and asked for help. When the police arrived at the scene, they didn't find John or his pickup. It seemed he had disappeared without a trace. I returned to normal life, but that night I realized that the world is full of darkness and horror that we don't always see. Now, every time I raise my thumb on the road, I remember John and his red eyes. And no matter what happens, I am always prepared for the possibility that my next hitchhike could be my last.